All right, today's focus, period 8. Period 8 is 1945 to 1980, and so the way that I would look at these bookend dates, is I would be focused 1945 is the end of World War II and the death of FDR. And so they're giving you hints because 1945 is bookending with the end of the FDR presidency. It still has the FDR legacy. 1980, though, is the election of Reagan, and you can see that in Reagan's election there's a lot of reversing of what FDR and LBJ is up to, and so they're showing you the bookends of the time period where you have a liberal trend, but then we're about to move into a more conservative trend when we move past 1980. With these threads, my hope is that these are better off for you than other content areas that you have that are earlier in the course, but any questions you have are totally fine and legit. But first of all, key concept 8.1, the United States responded to an uncertain and unstable post-war world by asserting and working to maintain a position of global leadership with far-reaching domestic and international consequences. If I was going to prep you for an essay question like that one, I would be prepping you with a compare-contrast between the ending of World War I and the ending of World War II. And in fact, that would be what I'd put at the top of this page. They're sending a signal to you that America behaved differently after World War II, where instead of isolating itself like it did after World War I and pulling backwards, it's instead going to be deeply involved in world affairs during this period afterwards. It mentions that we're engaged in a Cold War with the authoritarian Soviet Union, which means it's a dictatorship. We're seeking to limit the growth of communist military power and ideological influence, create a free market global economy, and build an international security system. Each of those things are code words for different events that took place. So when we think about, first of all, letter A, as your post-war tensions dissolved our relationship with the Soviet Union, we developed a foreign policy based on collective security. Collective security means that we are working with other people in alliances to protect ourselves from attack, and so this is just code for you to know the United Nations and NATO. They also mention that we are going to be depending on international aid and economic institutions that bolster non-communist nations. This is highlighting for you the idea of the Marshall Plan and the World Bank, where we're going to set up financial means to try to help countries that are either directly in the line of communism, like Europe, or else countries that we would refer to as third world countries. So let me give you some terminology from the Cold War. First world countries are countries aligned with the United States. They're democratic, they're capitalistic. Second world countries are aligned with the Soviet bloc, and so they are either Soviet Union or their allies in the Warsaw Pact or other countries that are affiliated with them. Third world countries are typically undeveloped countries that don't have an alliance with either side, and so they are seen as pawns to be played for, whether it's like a Korea or a Vietnam or African countries, Latin America, or so on. So when you think about the World Bank, we are very much trying to figure out ways to inspire investment inside those countries. You guys also learned about the rebuilding of both Germany and Japan that you can talk about during this time, especially Japan with Douglas MacArthur is going to be a demonstration of nation building with democracy and capitalism, and it really becomes the model for what America's up to from that time period forward, the idea that we can step in, rebuild the country, and reshape it in our own image. But we're going to find that partially the reason why that works is they're thoroughly devastated, unlike other places we'll be working with in our textbook. For letter B, we're concerned about the expansion of communist ideology, so we're going to seek to contain communism through a variety of measures, including major military engagements in Korea and Vietnam. So let's run through each of our presidencies to be able to knock that out. First of all, Truman has his Truman Doctrine. Protecting Greece and Turkey against communist infiltration. What's another example of Truman demonstrating the Truman Doctrine to resist communism? Korea, absolutely. Is there anything else? What about in Europe?
Oh, is that the...
That is the Berlin airlift. Very good. For Eisenhower, he is somebody who wants to pull back on military operations, so he takes us out of Korea, and he wants to put all of our money into the Air Force and nuclear weapons, so that we have massive retaliation capability. So if anybody messes with us, they get nuked. The danger of this is this could lead to mutually assured destruction and vaporize the entire planet. We're going to see Eisenhower getting involved in issues like the Suez crisis in Egypt. He's going to be involved in the Eisenhower Doctrine to protect oil reserves over in Europe. But we're going to find that during JFK's time, we are definitely going to be much more interventionist than Eisenhower was, especially when we take a look at events like the Bay of Pigs, Cuban Missile Crisis, but then also after the Cuban Missile Crisis, we kind of calmed down a little bit, and we realized we came close to nuclear war. So we have the Berlin Wall, which we tolerate and we don't try to actually tear down. But that's your key is then with JFK, that's when we're sending advisors to Vietnam, and then LBJ and Nixon are obviously the Vietnam conflict. For letter C, you'll see that there are periods of indirect military confrontation and periods of mutual coexistence or détente. And so détente rises with Nixon. So you've got the stuff before Nixon that's much more aggressive. Then Nixon, Ford, and Carter are détente, trying to weaken the tensions that are going on and trying to reestablish a good foreign policy with the Russians. And then you see Reagan pushing past that with his Reagan Doctrine. For letter D, notice the term decolonization and also nationalism, because they want you to understand that while we're competing over Cold War issues, what we see as a Cold War conflict, other countries will see as a nationalistic conflict. In cases like when you take a look at Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh is communist, but he's fighting for nationalistic independence from any sort of outside dominance. Egypt, during Eisenhower's presidency, when you have the Suez crisis where Nasser is trying to figure out ways to nationalize the Suez Canal and take it back from English control. Iran with the toppling of Mossadegh, where you had the CIA go in and stage a coup, largely because Mossadegh wanted to figure out who would give him the most money for his oil, whether it was America or Russia. He was just being capitalistic, and in return, there was a coup to take him out, and he was replaced by the Shah of Iran. You're going to see that then this is going to cause tensions with alignment, where America would like these countries to align, and they're not choosing to do so in some cases because they like playing Russia and the United States off of each other. Notice finally letter E, we are going to have that Cold War competition extend into Latin America, and you've got a few examples that they showed to you. Number one, the best example you can use for this box is Cuba. Becoming communist in 1959, overthrowing the dictator named Batista, who was a pawn of the United States government, nationalizing the economy, helping out other revolutions in places like Angola and other areas around the world. And then with the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Bay of Pigs, you can obviously see that caused tensions with the United States. Go ahead.
So during the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the Soviets agreed that they would take the missiles out of Cuba, did we then agree that we would take the missiles out of Turkey?
Yes.
Okay, because like on the test that we took, the like review test, there was something that said like if they agreed to take the missiles out of Cuba, they would take it out of Berlin. And I was like, that's not right.
It's not right.
Okay.
No, the way the deal went strictly is so that the Americans could save face, the Russians would pull the nukes out, and then we would promise not to invade or try to assassinate Castro anymore. But in a side deal, we promised to take our nukes out of Turkey, but Kennedy didn't want to make it look like a quid pro quo where because we were threatened, we would then take our nukes out of Turkey because he thought that would look like appeasement. And the nice thing was with Turkey, those missiles were already obsolete, so we were thinking about taking them out anyways, but this allowed us to save face. Okay. The other two groups that you can think about when you think about what's going on with Latin American affairs, remember when we looked at the Nixon presidency, we looked at Chile. We had a guy named Salvador Allende who was toppled by the CIA because Nixon didn't feel like he was sufficiently pro-American and he was replaced by a dictator. You also learned about the Iran-Contra scandal, so you'll be able to connect that forward when we get to the Reagan presidency. But your key when you think about this segment is when you learn about these trends, I'll have kids who will ask me on the AP test, is it okay, like in today's short answer essay questions, it said what trend or development was going on. And I had kids say, can I just label a trend without actually being specific? And what I would highlight for all of you guys to think about is typically when you take a look at a trend in U.S. history, There's a specific moment or historical event that can be tied to that trend to make it even more detailed and even more specific. Aim for that when you're doing any sort of writing. Try to have a specific fact that you're connecting in to demonstrate something with specificity. Your second thing says that the Cold War led to public debates over the power of the federal government and what means could be used for pursuing international and domestic goals while also protecting people inside the United States. So this is domestic anti-communism efforts that you're looking at for this entire page. Letter A, though, we're going to be taking a look at different web methods that were used to expose communists inside the United States. And the two trends that you should notice is, first of all, the HUAC. This is the group that Richard Nixon became famous for leading that was looking for conspiracies in Hollywood. This is going to lead to the Hollywood 10, where we're going to blacklist 10 people from Hollywood because they're suspected communists. And instead of agreeing to answer the questions, they're going to plead the fifth, and that's going to get them thrown in jail for contempt of court, and their careers are going to be ruined. When Nixon is leading this group, remember the most famous person to testify in favor of the group was Ronald Reagan, who established his anti-communist trends, and that helped him become a powerful politician later on. Remember also, there are two incidents at this time that lead Americans to believe that communists are out there and they're out of control: Alger Hiss and the Rosenbergs. The other anti-communist trend you should note for letter A is Joseph McCarthy and his McCarthy hearings, where he's trying to figure out where there are communists inside the United States government. And he is going to be enabled by the Republicans, led by Dwight D. Eisenhower, because he's largely labeling liberals as being engaged in creeping communism. But McCarthy is going to go too far when he decides to attack the military, and Eisenhower will then see that as going too far, attacking a group that he likes, and then McCarthy is going to be undercut. But until then, he's going to be laying out broad charges against a whole host of different people. And so with both these groups, the book that I would encourage you to think about using as your support is The Crucible by Arthur Miller. If you read that book in English or Cliff Notes or borrowed homework from somebody else this year when you were supposed to read that, that book is very much meant to be an allegory of communism and anti-communist hunts that are happening here in the country. With letter B, when we think about anti-communist foreign policy, it didn't face a whole lot of opposition during the 40s or the 50s or the early 60s, but once we got to the Vietnam War, you had massive protests by groups of people who would consider themselves doves. Many of them are protesting because of a credibility gap that is emerging, where they feel lied to by both Democrats and eventually Nixon and the Republicans about the progress of the war, and especially the unfairness of the draft, where if you were poor and uneducated, you stood a much better chance of ending up drafted than if you were somebody who was wealthy inside of our society. For letter C, notice that we're going to have debates about a number of different things. Number one, notice the debates about a large nuclear arsenal. And you see that debate playing out in a number of different time periods, whether it's with MAD, mutually assured destruction, or following the Cuban Missile Crisis, where we almost vaporized the planet, until eventually we had our SALT treaties, where we start limiting the number of nuclear weapons we have, and we also start limiting nuclear testing. You'll notice also that it says that we are going to be analyzing the military-industrial complex and its importance. And with that, please remember Eisenhower's farewell address, where he tells people, look, we got a problem, and I'm a military guy, but there are military manufacturers who really like making money from the federal government, but in order to make money off of weapons, we have to use some every once in a while, which means we might get dragged into wars that are unnecessary. And big picture, when people look... When people look back at history, the connection that people usually make with that Eisenhower quote is the Vietnam War, where that war does feel pretty extreme, especially with the amount of military hardware that we use while fighting in that war. If you want to connect backwards, also, a contextualization you could use is during the period right after World War I, Gerald Nye, with his Neutrality Act, argued that these individuals should be known as the merchants of death, because instead of worrying about American patriotism, they're just trying to get rich quick off of selling weapons that will get a bunch of kids killed. Finally, notice the question of the appropriate power of the executive branch in conducting foreign and military policy. We discussed that as being the imperial presidencies of LBJ and Nixon, where with the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, the Congress largely gave the president a blank check to do whatever the heck they wanted to. There was a feeling they abused that power by bombings and invasion of Cambodia and this deception that's going on. So we created the War Powers Act, which is what they're alluding to at that moment. But also remember, the War Powers Act has been violated by every single president without any sort of punishment or consequence. So it's pretty much a dead letter. It's out there, but no Congress has actually used it to punish a president. Go ahead. Yeah. Sure, the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution was in 1964, where Lyndon Johnson claimed that a boat called the USS Maddox was just minding its own business in the Tonkin Sea, the Gulf of Tonkin off the coast of Vietnam, out in neutral waters miles away from North Vietnam. Afterwards, though, after he used this as kind of like a Pearl Harbor sort of moment to get the United States government to support him in war, it turned out that he exaggerated or lied about the details of the attack, including the fact that the USS Maddox was not in neutral waters. It was in North Vietnamese waters, eavesdropping on radio traffic in North Vietnam, as if it was at war with North Vietnam already. And so when the North Vietnamese boats came out, it wasn't as if it was a neutral situation. They felt like their waters had been invaded. It's very similar to what war in the past where Lincoln demanded to see the bloody spot where the war started to find out if the war was legal. It's like the Mexican-American War, where instead of... It's like that war, the Mexican-American War, where Lincoln wanted to find out, were we really in neutral territory, or were we actually poking the bear with a stick? And if we were poking him, then the war is not legal. This is exactly what happens with the Gulf of Tonkin. We picked a war with them, and then we jumped in. Finally, with letter D, ideological, military, and economic concerns shape the United States' involvement in the Middle East, with several oil crises taking place. So let's run through each of those. Number one, following World War II, Truman is going to recognize that there's an easy source of oil in the Middle East. We become dependent on it. During Eisenhower's time, that's why he topples Mossadegh as the leader of Iran and replaces him with a dictator, the Shah of Iran, who we like. This is known as the Eisenhower Doctrine, where the Eisenhower Doctrine is we're going to protect our access to Middle Eastern oil, even though it's not ours. We're going to claim that access to it is an American right, to the point where we feel like we can be able to declare war in the area to protect our oil reserves that they currently own. The Eisenhower Doctrine. Sure. We do not want communism going there, but we especially don't want communist oil, because our cars run on oil. Well, of course we love American oil better, because, I mean, American oil is freedom oil. And so, when we take a look then at what happens after Eisenhower's presidency, when we move into the Kennedy, Nixon, Johnson, Nixon time period, you have now seen America becoming the supporter of Israel during the 6 Days War, during the Yom Kippur War, and eventually we're going to have an oil shock in 1973 because of American support for Israel during those conflicts. We're going to see another oil shock in 1979 when the Shah of Iran tries to get treated for cancer. He's replaced by the Ayatollah Khomeini, a fundamentalist Muslim leader who will cut off our oil again to show that OPEC can have influence over the United States by restricting the oil that we need for our entire economy and military to run. This is going to lead to an effort to try to create a national energy policy. Nixon, Ford, and Carter will do this. Carter especially is going to try to push us towards alternate energies like solar or other sorts of energies. And we're going to see Reagan pretty roundly reject that with the idea that we should stay based on oil as a reliable resource, with the idea that technology for alternative energy is far away. Your next page is all about civil rights. And so what I would put on the top of this page is your just highlight or remind yourself that this is where your civil rights organizer comes into play, where there's a lot of details that you guys took notes on, and not all of them need to be in your essays, but that detailed analysis will help you if you get a question about this entire page. And the reason why I highlight that so heavily when we're teaching is notice the way they put out this comment. It says, seeking to fulfill Reconstruction-era promises, civil rights activists and political leaders achieved some legal and political successes in ending segregation, although progress towards racial equality was slow. When I was spending all that time around spring break on civil rights, it was strictly because of that thing there, that it's got lots of tendrils that are going to different places. Let me break it apart for you. Seeking to fulfill Reconstruction-era promises, that's your 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. They promised an end to slavery, and citizenship, and voting rights, but you saw all those things get rolled back with Reconstruction, with like Jim Crow laws, black codes, and all sorts of other nasty stuff. Yeah?
For some reason I was written here, I don't know, But I think you had mentioned one time there was like the second era of Reconstruction.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So I was just making sure.
You're good.
Alright, so we're weird now.
That was like a humble brag show off right there. That was really cool.
Oh, thank you. No, I was wondering.
Let me just finish it up with, you are very smart. Good student. All right, so anyway, so you've got civil rights activists and political leaders. And one of the things that I tried to highlight for you when I was teaching the civil rights unit is for most historians, the reason why they've got this distinction, Martin Luther King is great, along with all the other civil rights leaders, but until this moment when they found sympathetic political leaders who were actually willing to put into effect legislation that would change things, that's what makes this time period different. The fact that you've got an FDR, a Truman, an Eisenhower, a Kennedy, a Johnson, who are all willing to start wading into this issue, that's when you start seeing momentum for change starting to take place. And notice how it says they achieved some legal and political successes in ending segregation. This is de jure segregation. But notice how they finish. Although progress towards racial equality was slow, that's de facto segregation. So that's why I taught you those Latin terms. It'll sound really impressive if you're able to delineate that, because that's where they want you to see we made some gains, but we also have some legacies, which means if you're noticing this, this is where your continuity, this could easily be a CCOT, where they could easily ask you continuity and change over time over race relations, and you'd be able to easily talk about how there was massive change with de jure segregation. But when it came to de facto segregation, there were some changes, but some things stayed the same racially because of the fact that that's a different inborn thing. So just keep that in mind, because that could easily be an essay question that could either pop up as this time period, or notice that this could also be contextualization. If they gave you this part as your essay, this could then be your synthesis later. And so you've got a lot of options that are available here. So first of all, during and after World War II, civil rights activists and leaders, most notably Martin Luther King, combated racial discrimination utilizing a variety of strategies, including legal challenges, direct action, and nonviolent protest tactics. So let's peel that apart and give you all of the different areas where you could run, understanding that your competition is just going to have Martin Luther King. So if you're really worried and you're like, too much, I've got, just hang with me and you'll be good. So remember, first of all, World War II, you had, you did have the double feat for victory, and remember, A. Philip Randolph, who threatened to march on Washington, and as a result, he was able to get from Franklin Roosevelt anti-discrimination legislation in jobs with the Fair Labor Practices Act. No, Fair Employment Practices Act. So this is the thing that says you can't discriminate against African Americans during World War II inside the wartime factories.
Was that the affirmative action?
That was not affirmative action. That's going to happen much later.
Oh, wait, yeah.
Isn't there also like executive order like 9?
Mm-hmm.
That was number 9066.
And 9066 is going to come later with Truman.
It is.
Perfect. So Truman is the next one you want to be able to take a look at. Truman is going to desegregate the military. And at about the same time, Jackie Robinson is going to desegregate Major League Baseball. So let me remind you of some groups. And again, you've got a study guide that's much more detailed, but let me highlight the different groups that we discussed in class, and you can choose which examples will help you out best. You learned about CORE during World War II, trying to get, in fact, protest for change. You also learned at the time you had the NAACP, and that's where you get into the first one where it says legal challenges. Remember, the NAACP were the legal challenge people, and they had that three-part plan for desegregation. Number one, take cameras and prove that segregation did mean unequal facilities. Number two, put the courts in the situation they need to pressure these states then to create equal facilities, and when they don't, then you desegregate. And so they're going to lay out a very methodical process to force desegregation to happen. And NAACP is going to work through court decisions, most importantly, the one that you see down here, Brown versus Topeka Board of Education. So these two boxes are going to be piggybacking back and forth from one another. Protesters right here, governmental action right here, like Truman's desegregation of the armed services. Remember, though, you've got other groups that are emerging that aren't working through the court system, and so please remember the Montgomery bus boycott. That is your Southern Christian Leadership Conference in the 1950s, 56. Remember also with Brown, though, you have an Eisenhower moment. And so when you get down to Brown versus Topeka Board of Education, you've got your situation with Brown, but then also remember over in this area, following Brown 3 years later, you've got the situation in Little Rock where Eisenhower needed to send in troops to desegregate the schools because they're trying to nullify that law.
Was that the Ruby Bridges thing?
I don't know.
Yeah, but like, where did she go?
First child to desegregate a white Southern elementary school in 1960. A little bit later.
Oh.
Okay? So let's get back to this box right here. So following Little Rock, the next movements that you saw taking place, 1960, you learned about SNCC. SNCC was that group that started desegregating lunch counters. Direct action, but it's kids, your age and a little bit older, who are doing more radical things. During Eisenhower's time, he didn't really want to deal with desegregation, but JFK gets elected using African-American votes, but barely wins. And so he doesn't want to touch desegregation because he's worried about the Solid South. So he wants nothing to happen. So remember, 1961, CORE and SNCC are going to do the freedom rides. That's meant to put pressure on JFK because these are all going to be televised, and it's going to show the world that there's still discrimination and that JFK is expected to do something about it. Following the freedom rides, you have later on, during JFK's presidency, Birmingham, Alabama. I'm sorry, and the letter from a Birmingham jail, where you have the kids who are getting attacked with fire hoses and police dogs. And if you remember, in Box B, that led JFK to create then the Civil Rights Act of 1963, but he couldn't get it through before he was assassinated. Your Civil Rights Act of 64 passed by LBJ. Remember, it's not just going to be about race, it's going to be about ethnicity, religion, and gender.
Oh, because like
Title IX will come after that as even an extension of what that's doing. But if you remember, after the Civil Rights Act of 64 gets passed, that doesn't mean voting rights has happened because you have Selma take place with what's known as Bloody Sunday. That's the SCLC and SNCC working together to try to protest. And that leads to the Voting Rights Act and the 24th Amendment, which gets rid of the poll taxes and other sorts of legal ways of blocking voting. It's with the Voting Rights Act of 65 that de jure segregation is then ended. But when you take a look at Box C then points out that following this point, you have people questioning the efficacy of nonviolence. So remember, your Black Power movement, your Black Panthers, your Nation of Islam. You have riots in places like Watts and Detroit and Minneapolis. And then finally you have the assassination of Martin Luther King in '68, which is traumatic. Does anybody have any questions about these first two pages before we move on? Sweet. Your next section then. This whole page that you see right here is all about civil rights movements that are inspired by Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement for African Americans. This first box, feminism, is going to become huge during this time period. Especially notice the group NOW, National Organization of Women, and their pursuit of the Equal Rights Amendment. It's in this box that you could easily have a conversation about the use of the pill for birth control. You could easily also talk about Betty Friedan and her feminine mystique, where she's arguing that the cult of domesticity is reigning in women.
Did we also talk about Roe versus Wade or Catholicism?
Certainly. 73. So it's going to be still during this time period. When it comes to LGBT movements, the big moment that you need to talk about is the Stonewall Inn protest, where that's going to be the inspiration for a burgeoning LGBT movement. For Box B, unfortunately, these are just treated as asides inside your textbook, and so I'll give you pieces of information you can use if these are introduced in your essays. So first of all, when it comes to the Latino movement, you want to be able to mention the name Cesar Chavez. He is, what's that? Which part? Caesar? Chavez?
It's right there.
C-H-A-V-E-Z? That's all right. So Cesar Chavez is going to be working with migrant workers in the southwestern part of the United States, especially grape harvesters, because they're being treated like slave labor because they're being threatened with extradition. And so he's going to expose the idea that there's a reason why your grapes are so cheap. It's because we're paying these guys almost nothing. He is also going to then become, this is going to become part of a Chicano movement that we have. There's also another group that is more radical called La Raza. And La Raza, or the people, are going to be looking at even more intervention to try to address the injustices that are going on between Mexican Americans and the country they're living in. Go ahead.
Is this an element of counterculture like everything else?
Yeah. When we come to the idea of American Indians, remember AIM, the American Indian Movement. They talked to you about how they took over Alcatraz, they took over Wounded Knee, they got in shootouts with the FBI at times. But eventually what happened was a recognition of tribal sovereignty with the idea that the Native Americans who are on reservations are a nation within a nation. So they improved their rights during this time period because of the injustices of the past. Finally, with Asian Americans, notice the Immigration Act of 1965, where up until that time period there were exclusion acts for Asians. They are now going to be working to get rid of that. And then also remember, at the start of Reagan's presidency, Japanese Americans are going to be pushing for reparations for their treatment during the internment camps during World War II. No, go ahead. 9066 for that one.
And the military was
The military one, the visa relief for the military was 9066. I'm pretty sure.
9981.
Wait, which one was 9066?
Internment camps.
That's the one. Okay. Got it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Letter C. Despite an overall affluence during this time period, there are people who are complaining about poverty as a national problem, especially connected to LBJ and his Great Society, his war on poverty. And then finally, letter D, you have an environmentalist movement that's getting started. So let me throw at you some names. Silent Spring. Yep, by Rachel Carson, complaining about DDT. Her inspiration is going to lead to a number of changes with Richard Nixon with the Environmental Protection Agency, or the EPA. We're going to have the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Endangered Species Act. And we will also see during Jimmy Carter's time a push towards alternative energies to try to roll back pollution. But then also we've got a couple of huge environmental disasters that you should be aware of when it comes to Box D. First one you should know about is Love Canal. Love Canal is on the East Coast. It was an area that was occupied by an industrial facility that during the early 20th century was producing a bunch of hazardous waste and just dumping it into a pit behind their facility. And then when they closed the facility down, they just put a clay cap over the top of that and then built houses on top of that clay cap. So they're sitting on top of toxic waste. And so when they started living in these homes, all of a sudden this weird stuff started bubbling through the lawns and their water started smelling nasty. And then they had a cancer bloom in the area where people started getting sick. But they were stuck in these houses because they couldn't sell because nobody would buy these houses from them. And so they decided to protest. And during Jimmy Carter's time, they were able to force him to buy their houses. And he created something called the Superfund. And the Superfund was a governmental program that would be used in government money to clean up environmental damage created by industries that during lax regulation were allowed to pollute, and then they were able to leave and not deal with the ramifications of what they've done. So there's dozens of Superfund sites all around the country where they're still trying to clean up those pollution effects decades later. Second environmental disaster you should notice is going to be the 3 Mile Island nuclear meltdown, where we have a nuclear power plant that melts down. And then they opened up the vents to the outside world to vent in air, and so they released radioactive isotopes into the neighborhood, making it really hard to build any more nuclear production facilities inside the country when we had something like that happen. FYI, you've got one upwind from you, and so up in Monticello we've got our own nuclear power plant, but it's safe. And so for you guys, don't worry about a thing. It's yes, the three-eyed fish is nothing to worry about. Those are good. Blinky. Next page. Liberalism influenced post-world politics and decisions, but it came under increasing attack from both the left and the right. So liberalism during this time period is highlighted by the Democratic Party with the idea that they are anti-communist with foreign policy, but they believe that the government can fix problems here inside the United States. You can see that with Truman's Fair Deal, Johnson's Great Society, and with letter B, the Great Society is going to attempt to use the government to create programs that will fix poverty and discrimination. So this is your Medicare, Medicaid, food stamps, welfare, Head Start, PBS, and a whole host of other different things. You also have a series of Supreme Court decisions that are going to expand civil liberties, whether it comes to criminal cases, where you learned about the Miranda case, or dealing with school prayer like Engel versus Vitale, eliminating school prayer as a daily factor that we have inside of our schools. By the way, if you are paying attention right now, inside of our legislature, there is currently a bill that's being proposed to put "In God We Trust" inside of every school, just so you can be aware of what you're going to school for. And so this battle that we have is currently still emerging inside of our politics, and we're still debating that. Roe versus Wade would also be one of these court cases you could easily weave into with the idea of legislation for rights. Griswold versus Connecticut over birth control would be another. And so you've got a whole host of them. And you've got a cram packet that I gave you that delineates all of those. For letter D, notice that there are some groups on the left who feel like the Democrats are doing too little to deal with racial or economic justice issues. And many of them are pursuing more radical means, whether it's the hippies during that time period or the weathermen during the 1960s engaging in terroristic tactics, the Black Panthers or others who want more to happen. But in the 1970s, we're going to find that there's a counter-revolution, your neoconservative rise, with the argument that we've got economic problems and economic challenges like stagflation. We have political scandals like Watergate, but then also the credibility gap. And then we've got foreign policy crises, especially in the 70s. Remember those oil shocks? And our issues going on with Afghanistan, where we feel like we're slipping, especially when it comes to Vietnam. So this is setting up for you that there's now a new opening for the neoconservatives, since there's some doubt about the liberals and what they're able to get done. We're also going to see in the 1970s clashes between conservatives and liberals over social and cultural issues. So please remember that's your moral majority that we see emerging during that time. The power of the federal government. Remember, that's the emergence of Milton Friedman and his idea of a new type of economics compared to Keynesian economics. There are debates over race. And with that debate over race, remember, that's over busing and affirmative action. And there are feelings that we should have movements for greater individual rights, especially with the shrinking of the federal government, so it's not seen as being so intrusive. Any questions about that page before we move on? Killer. Next page, let's take a look at economic changes we have during the 1940s to the 1980s. We have a gigantic private sector booming after World War II, where the economy starts producing things like cars and TVs and appliances and eventually stuff like houses and so on. It leads to also a moment where we have a boom in federal spending, both on military programs, but then also on our interstate highway system.
Would that be the thing that Eisenhower did? Would be like?
Yeah. You also have the baby boom, where massive numbers of people have babies and they need to buy stuff for their babies, including houses in the suburbs. But remember, you've got African Americans and other people frozen out of that housing because of redlining and other sorts of behaviors. And then finally, we have huge technological developments that is spurring growth, where people may be going into debt, but they're buying the newest and greatest things, trying to keep up with the Joneses. Now, when you take a look at that segment right there, remember that the key thing that's happening during the 40s and 50s then is an emphasis on conformity. And the song that we learned about in class was that Little Boxes song of Little Houses Made Out of Ticky-Tacky, where some people are scrutinizing that to figure out if that's the right way to go. Letter B. Remember that we have higher education booms that are taking place. The reason why we have a boom in higher education is because of your GI Bill. So massive numbers of soldiers, instead of dumping back into the workforce like they did after World War I and messing up the economy with an economic dip, we're going to instead send them off to college. They will get trained, and then they're going to help create new job opportunities with new technologies that are expanding. It's going to cause a growth of the middle class, a movement to the suburbs, and a movement to the south and the west, especially with the invention of the automobile in mass production and air conditioning. we're going to see that this movement then allows the Sun Belt to become more politically and economically powerful. So remember, we moved jobs from the Rust Belt down to the Sun Belt, especially for like aerospace, planes, and space technologies. And we're going to find that waves of new immigrants are going to start coming in after Lyndon Johnson's Immigration Bill of 1965. So that's getting rid of the Quota Acts of the 1920s, and it's now opening up immigration from Asia. And the side effect for this is we're going to get waves of immigrants from Asia and Latin America, not so much from Europe anymore. Especially Cambodian, Laotian, and Vietnamese people who are coming over in the wake of the Vietnam War for fear that they're going to get persecuted. Your next section, then, you've got demographic developments taking place that is going to be affecting American culture. So in our culture, it becomes increasingly homogenous, where everybody is watching the same thing like I Love Lucy or listening to Elvis Presley or doing all the same cultural elements. And it's leading to conformity, where you've got people who are seeing being different as being bad, or heaven forbid, it might be communism. You'll also notice with letter B, though, that there are going to be women and young people who participate in the counterculture movement. And what I'd like you to think about with this youth movement is, remember, this is coming from the free speech movement in Berkeley in the early 1960s in California. So you had kids on college campuses mad that they couldn't participate in free debates without college approval, and they started protesting. These are middle to upper income, elitist sort of kids, but they want to protest. These kids then will start looking for other areas of like horrible discrimination, which will lead them to join like the Freedom Summer movement in 1964, where they will go down south with CORE and SNCC to register voters because they see that as similar to what they experienced on college campuses, but far worse. They'll get involved in the ERA movement to try to create an equal rights amendment because they see what's happening with women as being discriminatory, and especially they'll get into the anti-war movement. For box C, though, this counterculture movement is going to lead to a counter-revolution led by your moral majority, especially led by fundamentalist Christians who feel like our morals are slipping inside of our country. So this is what you saw in the 1970s, and that Stop ERA movement is coming out of this movement, led by Phyllis Schlafly, who feels like the traditional family is under attack, and women will leave the home and go to work instead of raising their children. And so those two are playing back and forth across each other. So when you take a look at how we then move from this time period into period 9, you guys have now covered all of the stuff that we're going to be reviewing explicitly. Period 9 is now yours. And the thing that I'd like to highlight for you is when I look at this already, for period 9 we have already covered letters A and B, talking about Reagan's presidency, and also the argument that many people are saying that the liberal policies of the past did not solve the problems we were experiencing. So that's what you've studied already. This debate over the role of government is what we'll be doing for the remainder of the time that we're together when we look at Clinton and Bush and Obama about what do modern politicians think about those existing debates that we've had in the past. This next page is a very fluffy one, and you've covered all of this already. We're going to end up with more digital technologies that will help improve our standard of living, especially when it comes to the computers and the internet. But as a result of factories moving from the Rust Belt to the Sun Belt and then moving overseas, many of our good manufacturing jobs leave and we're left with service jobs. And as a result, our wages have been stagnating since the 70s. So this entire page we've covered already in class. This next page is pointing out this movement to the south and the west, and also increased migration is leading to political debates over these topics, which is where we're going to be over the next week and a half. And when we look at this page, we're going to be taking a look at what's our military role from this point forward. We've already studied what Reagan believed during the Cold War. We have now taken a look at what that did to end the Cold War, and this is where we are currently, taking a look at this last box as far as what does our foreign policy look like. Finally, on our last page, this is why I want you to read chapters 40 and 41. 41 in particular, they've got a whole page dedicated to the aftermath of September 11th, which means they're expecting you to know chapter 41 for either a multiple choice portion or a possible essay question or both. But remember, period 9 can only be a short answer essay option. It's not a mandatory. It'll be one of your options, or else it'll be a multiple choice set. So it's not like you got to devote a ton of time, but I would take time to read that and look at the crash course and you should be good. Any questions? Sweet. Next week is a thematic review, so when we get together, we'll look at themes, run those, and talk about how they trend throughout U.S. history, and do one final put together.
I feel so prepared this one.